Culture. Everyone has a culture. Until early in the 20th century, the term culture was used to indicate the refined ways of the elite and powerful. People who were knowledgeable in history, literature, and fine arts were said to possess culture. No longer is culture viewed as so narrowly. Anthropologists define culture as a way of perceiving, believing, evaluating, and behaving. Good enough, 1987. It provides a blueprint that determines the way we think, feel, and behave in society. Our culture is in us, all around us, and just as the air we breathe. Erickson, 1997, page 33. What appears as the natural and only way to learn to interact with others, example, respond to our grandparents, is determined by our culture. Generally accepted and patterned ways of behavior are necessary for a group of people to live all together. Culture imposes order and meaning in our experiences. It allows us to predict how others will behave in certain situations. Culturally determined norms guide our language, behavior, emotions, and thinking in different situations. They are the do's and don'ts of appropriate behavior within our culture. Or else we are comfortable with others who share the same culture because we know the meaning of their words and actions. We often misunderstand the cultural cues of persons from different cultures. Culture is so much a part of us that we do not realize that not everyone shares our culture. This may be in part because we have never been in cultural settings different from our own. This lack of knowledge often leads to our responding to differences as personal affronts rather than as cultural differences. This misunderstanding may appear insignificant to an observer, but they can be important to participants. Examples include how loud is too loud, how late one may arrive at an event, and how close one can stand to another without being rude or disrespectful. Characteristics of culture. We all have culture, but how did we get it? The first characteristic of culture is that it is learned, and the learning starts at birth. The way a child is held, fed, bathed, and dressed is culturally determined. This process continues throughout life. Two similar processes interact as one learns how to act in society. Inculturation and socialization. Inculturation is the process of acquiring the characteristics of a given culture and generally becoming competent in its language and ways of behaving and knowing. Socialization is the general process of learning the social norms of the culture. Through this process, we internalize social and cultural rules. We learn what is expected in social rules. Through this process, we internalize social and cultural rules. We learn what is expected in social roles, such as mother, husband, student, or child, and in the occupational roles of teacher, banker, plumber, custodian, or politician. Inculturation and socialization are processes initiated at birth by others, including parents, siblings, nurses, physicians, teachers, and neighbors. These varied instructors may not identify these processes as inculturation or socialization, but they demonstrate and reward children for acceptable behaviors. We learn how to behave by observing and participating in society and culture. Thus, people are socialized and enculturated according to the patterns of the culture in which they are raised. The culture in which one is born becomes unimportant unless one is also socialized in that culture. Because culture is so much more a part of us, we tend to confuse biological and cultural heritage. Our cultural heritage is learned. It is not innately based on the culture in which we were born. Vietnamese infants adopted by Italian American, Catholic, middle class parents will share a cultural heritage with middle-class Italian American Catholics rather than with Vietnamese in Vietnam. Observers, however, will continue to identify these individuals as Vietnamese Americans because of physical characteristics and lack of knowledge about their cultural experiences. A second characteristic of culture is that it is shared. Shared cultural patterns and customs bind people together as an identical, oh my goodness. Shared cultural patterns and customs bind people together as an identifiable group and make it possible for them to live together and function with ease. An individual in the shared culture is provided with the context for identifying with the group that shares that culture. Although there may be some disagreement about certain aspects of the culture, there is a common acceptance and agreement about most aspects. Actually, most points of agreement are outside our realm of awareness. For example, we do not even realize that the way we communicate with each other and the foods we eat are a part of culture. Third, culture is an adaptation. Cultures accommodate environmental conditions and available natural and technological resources. Thus, the Eskimo who lived with extreme cold, snow, ice, seals, and the sea developed a culture different from that of the Pacific Islander who has limited land, unlimited seas, and few mineral resources. The culture of urban residents differs from that of rural residents in part because of the resources available in the different settings. The culture of oppressed groups differs from that of the dominated group because of power relationships within society. Finally, culture is a dynamic system that changes continuously. Some cultures undergo constant and rapid change, others are very slow to change. Some changes, such as a new word or a new hairstyle, may be relatively small and have little impact on their culture as a whole. Other changes have a dramatic impact. The introduction of technology into a culture has often produced changes far broader than the technology itself. For example, the replacement of industrial workers with robots is changing the culture of many working class communities. Such changes may also alter traditional customs and beliefs. Manifestations of culture. The cultural patterns of a group of people are determined by how the people organize and view the various components of culture. Culture is manifested in an infinite number of ways through social institutions, lived experiences, and the individual's fulfillment of psychological and basic needs. To understand how extensively our lives are affected by culture, let's examine a few other manifestations. Our values are initially determined by our culture. Values are conceptions of what is desirable and important to us or to our group. Our values influence prestige, status, pride, family loyalty, love of country, religious belief, and honor. Status symbols differ across cultures. For many families in the United States, accumulation of material possessions is a respected status symbol. For others, the welfare of the extended family is of utmost importance. These factors, as well as what is decent or indecent, what is moral or immoral, and how punishment and reward are provided, are determined by the value system of the culture. Culture also manifests itself in the nonverbal communication used by individuals. The meaning of an act or an expression must be viewed in its cultural context. Raising the eyebrow is an example. To most Americans, this means surprise. To a person from the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, it signals an affirmative answer. For Greeks, it is a sign of disagreement. The difference is not so much in how the eyebrows are raised, but in the cultural meaning of the act. Spradley and Reinikovic, 1975, page 7. Culture also determines the manner of walking, sitting, standing, reclining, and gesturing. We must remind ourselves not to interpret acts and expressions of people from a different cultural background as wrong or inappropriate just because they are not in the same as ours. Language itself is a reflection of culture and provides a special way of looking at the world and organizing experiences that is often ignored in translating words from one language to another. Many different sounds and combinations of sounds are used in the language of different cultures. Those of us who have tried to learn a second language may have experienced difficulty in verbalizing the sounds that were not part of our first language. Also, diverse language patterns found within the same language group can lead to misunderstandings. For example, one person's joking is heard by others as serious criticism or abuse of power. This is a particular problem when the speaker is a member of the dominant group and the listener is a member of the oppressed group. Although we have discussed only a few daily patterns determined by culture, they are limitless. Among them are relationships of men and women, parenting, choosing a spouse, sexual relations, and division of labor in the home and society. These patterns are shared by members of the culture and often seem strange and improper to non-members. Ethnocentrism. Because culture helps determine the way we think, feel, and act, it becomes the lens through which we judge the world. As such, it can become an unconscious blinder to other ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. Our own culture is automatically treated as innate. It becomes the only natural way to function in the world. Even common sense in our own culture is naturally translated to common sense for the world. What? Even common sense in our own culture is naturally translated to common sense for the world. The rest of the world is viewed through our cultural lenses. Other cultures are compared with ours and are evaluated by our own cultural standards. It becomes difficult, if not impossible, to view other culture as separate from our own, a task that anthropologists attempt when studying other cultures. This inability to view other cultures as equally viable alternates for organizing reality is known as ethnocentrism. It is a common characteristic of cultures whereby one's own cultural traits are viewed as natural, correct, and superior to those of another culture whose traits are perceived as strange, inferior, or wrong. Although it is appropriate to cherish one's culture, members sometimes become closed to the possibilities of difference. Feelings of superiority over other cultures often develop. The inability to view other culture through its cultural lenses rather than through one's own cultural lenses. Why did they write this like this? Okay. The inability to view another culture through its cultural lenses rather than one's own cultural lenses prevents an understanding of the second culture. This inability can make it impossible to function effectively in a second culture. By overcoming one's ethnocentric view of the world, one can begin to respect other cultures and even learn to function comfortably in more than one cultural group. Cultural relativism. Cultural relativism. Cultural relativism. Never judge another man until you have walked a mile in his moccasins. This North American Indian proverb suggests the importance of understanding the cultural backgrounds and experiences of other persons rather than judging them by our own standards. The principle of cultural relativism is to see a culture as if we are a member of the culture. In essence, it is an attempt to view the world through the other individual's cultural lenses. It is an acknowledgement that another person's way of doing things, while perhaps not appropriate for us, may be valid for him or her. This ability becomes more essential than ever in the world today as countries and cultures become more interdependent. In an effort to maintain positive relationships with the numerous cultural groups in the world, the United States cannot afford to ignore other cultures or to relegate them to an inferior status. Within our own boundaries are many cultural groups that historically have been viewed and treated as inferior to the dominant Western European culture that has been the basis for most of our institutions. These intercultural misunderstandings occur even when no language barrier exists and when large components of the major culture are shared by the people involved. These misunderstandings often occur because one cultural group is largely ignorant about the culture of another group and gives the second culture little credibility. One problem is that members of one group are, for the most part, unable to describe their own cultural system, let alone another. These misunderstandings are common among the various groups in this country and are insinuated by differential status based on race, gender, and class. Cultural relativism suggests that people need to learn more about their own culture than is commonly required. What? Cultural relativism suggests that people need to learn more about their own culture than is commonly required. Oh, that makes sense. That must be followed by study about and interaction with other cultural groups. This intercultural process helps one know what it is like to be a member of the second culture and to view the world from that point of view. To function effectively and comfortably within a second culture, that culture must be learned. So in her book, Anything We Love Can Be Saved, A Writer's Activism by Alice Walker, in chapter The Sound of Our Own Culture, she talks about soul nurture, and she pretty much is talking about how she is discovering who she is, or wanting to discover who she is from her past and living in the South and her grandmothers and her mother. So there is a section I wanted to read about culture, which I thought was very interesting. And it says, I thought sitting there of the word culture, quote unquote. And because I am a gardener and grew up under the teachings of my mother, a gardener, and my father, a farmer, I considered what it means literally in terms of health and growth. Quote unquote culture is something in which one should thrive, the body and spirit simultaneously. But in the United States of America, for so many of our people, that is not happening. Instead, like plants whose roots are sunk in poisonous soil, we find ourselves producing generation after generation of blighted fruit. And why is this? It is because the dominant culture, whose values are designed to encourage the full development of the white and the male only, and not even of the disadvantaged in those categories, leaves the rest of us unsupported, except in ways that are frequently injurious to us. It is also because many of us have forgotten or can no longer recognize our own culture at its healthiest. We no longer know that it is the soil we need in order to survive, in order to thrive.